My name is Fulvia Vargas de Leon, and I am an Associate Counsel with Latino Justice. My portion of today's webinar will cover the redistricting process in New York. All right, so as we begin speaking on redistricting and reapportionment, I want to highlight two words that you may hear throughout this presentation or throughout the redistricting process in New York. The first is reapportionment, and what reapportionment means is the determination of how the 435 seats in Congress will be allocated. What we will be speaking about today is redistricting, which is the redrawing of congressional and legislative districts in New York. As is noted on this slide, according to the last census report, reapportionment data will be released on April 30th, 2021. That is tentative. The redistricting data is set for September 30th, 2021. So just to add some humor of sorts to this presentation, here is a political cartoon I found. It's two puzzle pieces. It says gerrymandered district. On the left, the piece says we're your elected officials. And on the right, it says exactly, we elected you to be our voters. So just as we navigate redistricting, I do want you to consider that redistricting will impact not only who gets to vote within the district, but how the power of that vote and who is ultimately elected to represent those voters. Okay, so New York redistricting in 2021. Some of us here today are experts in what I call redistricting. They have done many, many redistricting cycles. But one thing we all share right now is that all of us are new to this redistricting process in New York. None of us have ever experienced a redistricting process that is managed by what is now called the Independent Redistricting Commission, which I will speak about in the next slide. So in 2014, there was a constitutional amendment that established the Independent Redistricting Commission. You will see me refer to this commission as the IRC throughout the presentation. So what exactly is the Independent Redistricting Commission? So prior to the creation of the Independent Redistricting Commission, so prior to 2014 in the last redistricting cycle, which took place in 2011, redistricting was conducted solely by the state legislature through the New York State Legislative Task Force on Demographic Research and Reapportionment, also known as LATFR to most people. So that it was the commission or the group that redistricted in New York as part of the legislature. It was all done by the legislature. There was no independent commission. Now in 2014, this amendment was created that established the Independent Redistricting Commission. That commission is a 10-member commission, which draws boundaries for both congressional and state legislative redistricting. The state and assembly majority and minority leaders each appoint 2 members to the commission for a total of 8 appointed commissioners. And then those 8 appointed commissioners must then select by majority the final commissioner. As part of the 2014 amendment, there were set redistricting requirements that were set by the New York State Constitution. The commission was required, when the redistricting process would begin, the redistricting commission was required to make sure that any maps that were created followed these principles. The first, contiguity, which means that each state shall consist of contiguous territory, meaning you can travel from any point in the district to any other point within such district without crossing the district boundary. Basically, in the most simple terms, what that meant was that if I was within my voting district and I crossed the street and then I turned the corner, I am not stepping back and forth into other voting districts. Compactness, each district shall be as compact in form as practicable. Competition, districts cannot be drawn to discourage competition or for the purpose of favoring or disfavoring a particular candidate or political party. And the commission must also consider maintaining existing districts. Political boundaries, the redistricting plan must heed county and municipal boundaries and preserve the integrity of county and city lines as much as is possible. The commission shall consider the maintenance of core of existing districts of pre-existing political subdivisions, including counties, cities, and towns, and communities of interest. Now, I want to stop here and really highlight this point in light of Carlos's presentation on what this redistricting cycle would mean for the Hispanic community in light of the increase in the Hispanic population in New York City. So when we talk about political boundaries and competition, we're talking about the commission being required to keep these, to draw districts and maintain what I would call the status quo as much as possible. But what does this mean for redistricting today when it comes to addressing the growth of Latinos in New York? Any map, just for clarification, any map that is drawn must still comply with Section 2 requirements, as was discussed by my colleague Juan. Maintaining existing district in light of an increase in Hispanic population may lead to voter dilution or Section 2 violations, depending on how that population is distributed among the districts. Also, we must consider, as Carlos mentioned, where will the loss of seats occur in New York? The idea of maintaining existing districts as much as possible must be discussed in the context of whether any changes will dilute voting power of Hispanic districts, which are already established in New York. The idea is not to just have a seat at the table for the Hispanic community and the voting power that they currently hold, but they should also be able to have an impact in the electoral changes within the voting districts where there are a majority population. So the current plan for redistricting through the Independent Redistricting Commission, or the IRC, is after engaging in public hearings, and there is a lot of details about where those hearings will be held in the Constitution, and following the criteria that was set forth in the previous slides, the IRC must draw and approve a map with at least 7 votes, including 1 commissioner appointed by each legislative leader. If the legislature is under divided party control, which it is not at this point, the 7 votes must include at least 1 appointee by the Speaker and 1 by the Senate temporary president. If no map reaches the threshold, commission will forward the map with the most commission support to the state legislature. So based on the current timeline in the Constitution, the IRC would submit the first proposed map to the legislature by January 1st, with some leeway to propose a map as late as January 15th of 2022. This legislature at that point can approve the maps without amendment or reject the plan. When the state, just as a note, when the state and assembly are controlled by the same party, as is the case now, votes to approve a map must get 2/3 support in each chamber. If split party control, approval requires a simple majority. So let's say the plan is submitted, the legislature decides to reject the map. The IRC then has a second opportunity to submit a map no later than February 28th of 2022. If that map is rejected or vetoed, the process then moves out of the IRC, and the legislature now is tasked with drawing its own maps, however it decides to do so, or make amendments to plans if they see it's fitting. And do know that throughout this process, the governor's vetoes at that point can be overridden if he or she vetoed any previous maps. Now, as I said before, those were the amendments and the timeline that was set forth when the amendment passed in 2014. However, recently, as recent of January, there was a proposed change to that amendment that will be on the November 2021 ballot. Now, these changes were made or according to the legislature, are in place to move the timeline of when redistricting plans would be submitted and approved to conform to when our primaries are held. In 2014, we did not have primaries held in June, and so because of that change, this new amendment was created to kind of align with that timeline. Now, of course, we're all assuming that we are going to receive the data from the census by September 30th, and we're hopeful maybe that it's even sooner so that the Redistricting Commission can get to work. But working with that premise, this 2021 amendment, which will be voted on in November, requires that the first plan be submitted no later than January 1st. So there's no longer that January 15th deadline. The second plan must be submitted by January 15th. If the second plan is rejected by the legislature or vetoed by the governor, the legislature can amend the second plan as it deems necessary. So there's no longer that February 28th deadline. It just moves up the process significantly. Calls for maps to be approved without the support of 7 or more commissioners, regardless of partisan control of the legislature. So it no longer requires it to be, depending on how the votes are split within the commission, it just requires 7 votes for approval out of the 10 members. Regardless of legislature party control, a simple majority is sufficient for map approval in the Senate and Assembly. So this does away with the 2/3 requirement that was initially in place by the 2014 amendment. That portion of the amendment was put in place to ensure that regardless of party control, minority party would have a say, at least a decisive say, in the maps that are selected. So it would do away with that 2/3 requirement. If legislature is responsible for map drawing, a 60% majority is sufficient for approval, regardless of partisan control. Additional changes proposed in the amendment also include capping the state centers at 63 state members and prison gerrymandering. So including for redistricting purposes that persons incarcerated will be counting at their last place of residence. These are some of the legal challenges and consideration that we can speak on in the 2021 redistricting. I will not go too much into it, but something for you to think about if you're curious about case law that pertains to redistricting in this upcoming cycle. So lastly, I want to speak on the goals for the Hispanic community in 2021 redistricting. Given the growth in population, we want to advocate against maps which push forward vote dilution among the community, or what we call maps which have the power to minimize or cancel out the voting strength of the community. We have to think about, is there an opportunity today to create for an additional majority Hispanic voting district? We also have to ensure that given the loss of population that was highlighted by across the state, drawing of maps is not at the expense of a largely Hispanic voting district. We do not want to do away with the progress that we've already made. We also want to that we are engaging the community and understanding the importance of redistricting, why it matters, what does it affect,